a core principle of American governance has just been, well, it's been spectacularly compromised. Federal authorities have uncovered a multi-billion-dollar domestic welfare fraud network based in Minnesota that wasn't just stealing taxpayer funds. No, it was systematically routing that money overseas, effectively funding an al-Qaeda-linked terrorist organization operating thousands of miles away. When the safeguards meant to protect the nation's most vulnerable instead become cash pipelines for terror, we are facing more than just a crime. We are facing a national security emergency. This crisis prompted an unprecedented, immediate, and geographically specific policy action that has fundamentally altered the immigration and security landscape overnight. We are dissecting the full story, the intricate mechanisms of the crime, and the political failures that allowed this catastrophe to grow unchecked. Stay with us as we break this down in our in-depth discussion right here on News Focus Podcast. And if you find our reporting valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to support our channel. We truly appreciate it.
You know, to frame this, the events of the last few weeks in Minnesota represent a real collision point. We are seeing what happens when domestic governmental oversight fails so completely that the consequences become international security liabilities. This isn't just about the scale of the theft, which is, it's immense. It's about the catastrophic vulnerability the system revealed.
Okay, let's unpack this policy shockwave.
Right.
Because that's where the story takes its most acute, immediate turn.
Right.
The federal government, specifically President Trump, issued an emergency order that immediately terminated temporary protected status, or TPS, but with a highly unusual specific caveat. It was only for Somali nationals who were associated with the state of Minnesota.
And that specificity is really the key here. When we talk about temporary protected status, you have to understand, we're talking about a policy designed to grant safe harbor to foreign nationals who can't return to their home country.
Because of war or a natural disaster, something like that.
Exactly. Ongoing armed conflict, environmental disaster, or other extraordinary conditions. And TPS designations are typically applied universally to a nationality. If they're terminated, there's usually a lengthy phase-out period, we're talking 12 to 18 months, to allow families to adjust their status or depart.
This was the opposite of a phase-out. This was an immediate operational guillotine.
Precisely. The sources all confirm this was not a warning. It was an instant termination. Federal officials framed this swiftness as absolutely necessary to halt and I'm quoting here, rapid escalation national security vulnerability.
So they weren't signaling an intention to act.
No, they were acting immediately to choke off a financial pipeline that they believed was active and dangerous in that very moment.
And what was the immediate logistical impact of using Minnesota as the exclusive geographical target for this action? That's just unprecedented.
The disruption was immediate and massive. You have tens of thousands of individuals, many of whom have held this protected status for decades and established deep roots in the state. Jobs, mortgages, businesses. They lost their legal protections overnight.
Wow.
Immigration offices were entirely blindsided by the speed, and DHS field units were activated across the region to prepare for immediate enforcement.
The message was clearly designed to be maximum disruption, maximum shock.
Oh, it was intended to be non-negotiable. And the sources highlight that the presidential communication strategy just amplified this urgency. Instead of a formal DHS press release, which would have involved agency bureaucracy and, a lot of legal review, President Trump posted the termination announcement directly on social media.
And in that post, he bypassed all the typical bureaucratic language. He explicitly framed Minnesota as a hub of fraudulent money laundering activity enriching terror networks abroad.
And that one unfiltered statement achieved two things instantly. First, it cemented the rationale for the action as national security, not simply immigration enforcement or welfare fraud.
Right.
Second, it instantly attached the geographic location of Minnesota to the threat of terror financing. This completely reframed the entire political and legal debate surrounding the action.
It moved it from a debate about aid to a debate about existential risk. But now we have to look at the community impact. This action was surgically targeted at the largest concentration of Somali immigrants in the entire country.
That's right. We have to appreciate the scale of the population we're discussing here. Minnesota is home to an estimated 70,000 Somali residents. Many of these families arrived in the U.S. seeking refuge from the decades-long civil war and instability in Somalia, establishing what are now multi-generational communities in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the surrounding suburbs.
So an immediate sweeping termination hit the exact demographic population where federal investigators were alleging this massive linked fraud network operated. That must have created what the sources consistently described as an atmosphere of maximum uncertainty and fear.
The emotional fallout was catastrophic. I mean, within hours, the community infrastructure, the mosques, cultural centers, community leaders, they were completely overwhelmed. And the fear was compounded by the lack of official clarity.
People didn't know what was happening.
Well, people didn't know if they had 24 hours or 30 days to pack. Rumors of mass raids and immediate deportations spread like wildfire on social media platforms. It led many immigrant parents to keep their children home from school, just fearful of any contact with authorities.
And the sources documented scenes of just profound legal and logistical chaos.
Exactly. Immigration lawyers reported their phones exploding with calls from terrified clients seeking clarity on their immediate status. Advocacy groups had to pivot overnight to figure out how to even challenge an order that utilized a national security exception to apply immigration law selectively based on state residency.
It was a whole new legal frontier.
It introduced an entirely novel and legally contested dimension to the crisis, yeah.
And the response from community leaders was, I imagine, fierce and emotional.
They described the TPS termination as an attack on the community and expressed a deep sense of betrayal. They argued that a few criminal actors were being used to justify collective punishment against tens of thousands of law-abiding families who had diligently built lives and contributed to the state for decades.
And that tension is really at the heart of it.
It is. This tension between necessary enforcement against criminals and the fear of a sweeping impact on the entire community, it really defined the immediate political landscape.
The policy response was extraordinary, no doubt, but it was driven by the extraordinary scale and nature of the crime itself. Let's shift now and really dissect the anatomy of this fraud. Because federal prosecutors didn't just find isolated instances of theft, they concluded this was a highly organized system.
The U.S. Attorney's Office's conclusion was truly stunning. They found that these separate fraud cases, which at first appeared as unrelated criminal prosecutions, were in fact components of a single linked multi-program criminal ecosystem.
An ecosystem.
Yes. This was an infrastructure designed specifically for mass theft from the public purse.
So this wasn't just opportunistic crime, it was systemic. What was the methodology behind this ecosystem? How did it work?
It was complex and multi-layered. We are talking about coordinated operations that relied on simultaneously exploiting multiple government programs. The methodology involved creating shell nonprofits, often quickly registered with the state, that served as conduits for federal funds.
Okay.
They used fake clinics, fabricated client rosters, and falsified billing across all available social services programs.
The sheer speed and coordination meant they could maximize illicit gain really rapidly across several sectors at once.
And this leads to the federal conclusion of, and I'm quoting again, fraud stacked on fraud. They didn't just exploit child nutrition, they also exploited Medicaid, housing support, and other vulnerable streams simultaneously. The criminals treated the entire suite of state-administered federal welfare programs as one large, interconnected target.
So it wasn't one leak, it was like they blew up the whole dam.
That's a good way to put it. This simultaneous exploitation is what transformed large-scale crime into a fundamental threat to the state apparatus itself.
Let's break down the staggering numbers, because the audacity of the fraud is what makes it so hard to comprehend. We have to start with the most infamous case, the Feeding Our Future scandal involving child nutrition fraud. What does a $300 million scale even tell us?
Well, the $300 million figure makes this one of the largest pandemic-era fraud cases in U.S. history. This scheme specifically exploited federal child nutrition programs, which were, rapidly expanded and granted waivers during the COVID-19 pandemic to ensure food security for children while schools were closed.
What were the specific waivers that opened the door to such exploitation? What was the loophole?
Crucially, the waivers allowed non-school entities, nonprofits, and community organizations to serve meals without the usual stringent oversight that's typically applied to school districts. The required documentation was simplified, and the speed of disbursement was prioritized over verification.
Get the money out the door.
Get the money out the door. The fraudsters realized they could create these shell nonprofits almost instantly, declare fake meal sites, and just bill the government for phantom meals.
And this led to the illustrative absurdity that the sources constantly cite. Over 200 fake meal sites popping up virtually overnight.
Right, and the most egregious example, which should have been an immediate massive red flag, was a small 35-seat restaurant claiming to serve 18,000 meals a day.
18,000 a day.
A day. If you do the math, that means they would have had to serve over 500 meals per operating hour, nonstop. Logistically, it's just nonsensical.
Yet the money was paid out.
It was paid up because the system was designed for speed, not for verification. They used fabricated attendance sheets, phony invoices for food that was never purchased, and fake rosters of children they claimed to be feeding. So far, over 80 individuals have been indicted, cementing this as a highly sophisticated operation that mastered exploiting emergency governmental generosity.
But as you pointed out, the fraud was diversified. It moved beyond food and into the complex world of healthcare, specifically targeting services for vulnerable populations, like autism therapy under Medicaid.
Yes, this is the $14 million autism therapy and Medicaid scam. And this mechanism required a different layer of sophistication, a medical layer. The criminal network set up ostensibly legitimate clinics that billed Medicare and Medicaid. They charged for therapy sessions that were either dramatically inflated, truncated, or in many cases simply never occurred.
How did they manage the medical documentation required for this? I mean, that seems much harder to fake.
You'd think so. But they forged diagnostic documents, they falsified treatment logs, and they used sophisticated billing codes that were then recycled across multiple fake or unaware patients. In some instances, they billed for children who didn't even have an autism diagnosis. They were relying on the high volume of claims to just slip under the radar of state-level oversight mechanisms that typically only audit a tiny percentage of claims. It really demonstrated the criminal ecosystem's flexibility and expertise in navigating these highly regulated systems.
And then we come to the most rapid surge, which federal analysts pointed to as definitive proof of a system entirely out of control. The Housing Stabilization Service fraud.
The data point here is truly shocking, and it highlights a monumental systemic failure. Spending on this specific housing support program exploded from $2.5 million to an astonishing $661 million.
In how long?
In just 6 months.
6 months, from $2.5 million to over $660 million.
Right. This rapid acceleration is unlike anything you'd see in a legitimate program expansion.
So what specifically allowed that program to be drained so quickly?
Federal analysts concluded that the spike was so extreme, it indicated the system was, in their words, completely unprotected against exploitation. The Housing Stabilization Service program was newer. It was designed to quickly help vulnerable individuals maintain or acquire housing. So it likely lacked the basic cross-checks and verification requirements that older programs had in place. The criminals saw a fast-moving, high-value target with lax gatekeepers.
And the conclusion was that most of that $661 million went straight into criminal hands.
That was the admission by state investigators. The goal of the fraudsters here was rapid extraction. Just drain the program as quickly as possible before robust oversight could even be implemented. They understood that time lag between policy implementation and effective state auditing, and they maximized that window, contributing hundreds of millions to the overall billion-dollar loss.
What is perhaps most tragic about this entire ecosystem of fraud is the recurring theme that this didn't have to happen. We have extensive testimony that insiders flagged these issues long ago, only to be ignored.
This really brings us to the crux of the failure institutional accountability. We have the powerful public testimony of a Somali-American former state fraud investigator. He publicly confirmed that nearly all defendants in the largest fraud cases came from his own community.
And he wasn't trying to indict his community.
No, not at all. His intent was to use his position of authority and his intimate knowledge to highlight a clear, observable criminal pattern that was being systematically ignored by his superiors.
So he was speaking from a position of community expertise. Yet his warnings were dismissed by state officials. Why?
The sources strongly suggest that these warnings were dismissed for years, creating crucial missed opportunities to stem the tide of illicit funds. Federal prosecutors now believe that robust action on those early warnings could have prevented billions in losses. The internal reluctance to act, which we can get into, was rooted in a complex mix of political sensitivity, fear of accusations of bias, and just operational understaffing.
But once the federal indictments dropped, that floodgate of information opened up, didn't it?
Absolutely. The initial indictments in the Feeding Our Future case triggered a tidal wave of new information. Insiders, former employees of the fraudulent nonprofits, contractors, even relatives of the defendants began contacting federal agents. And every tip just broadened the scope of the probe, pushing the investigation far beyond the initial pandemic meal delivery claims.
And this is where the money trail started leading into truly sensitive areas.
Exactly. The new information focused heavily on suspicious money transfers, the use of shell corporations registered in other states, and financial transactions that strongly suggested coordination with overseas entities. This confirmed the federal agency's initial assessment. The network was far bigger than initially believed, cementing the crisis as a sweeping federal priority and linking the massive domestic fraud to something much darker.
And that darker link is what elevates this from a catastrophic financial scandal to a genuine national security emergency, which is the core reason for the TPS termination. Let's move to that. The explosive allegation of the Al-Shabaab connection.
This specific finding was the crucial turning point. This was the information that forced the president's hand. Senior federal agents delivered a highly sensitive classified briefing to President Trump. This briefing detailed the coordinated fraud operations and, critically, identified patterns of suspicious overseas transfers linked to the stolen funds.
What was the decision point that transformed this from a financial crime into a policy intervention? What was the moment?
The decision point was the conclusion, based on the money trail analysis, that immediate policy action was necessary to disrupt the flow of funds to a designated foreign terrorist organization. This briefing transformed the situation instantly from a local scandal managed by the FBI and local police into a sweeping federal priority requiring the full weight of presidential executive authority.
Now let's detail the money trail itself.
Yeah.
How were these stolen U.S. taxpayer funds, originating from welfare programs in Minnesota, routed across continents?
Investigators traced the funds being funneled overseas primarily through informal value transfer systems. The most commonly cited were the Hawala networks and the use of shell businesses to obscure the origin of the money.
We need to take a moment here to explain exactly what Hawala is, because for many listeners, this might sound like some kind of black market finance, but it has a much deeper history, particularly in the Somali context.
That's a critical distinction. Hawala, which literally means transfer or trust in Arabic, is an ancient trust-based system used to transfer money across borders without physically moving cash. It relies on a network of brokers or hawaladars who operate on a ledger system of trust and debt.
And why is this system so essential in places like Somalia?
Well, traditional banking infrastructure is often unstable, inaccessible, or just non-existent in regions experiencing conflict. Hawala allows Somali diaspora communities globally to send vital remittances, money for food, medicine, and family support home, quickly and cheaply. It is a legitimate, vital mechanism for survival for millions of people.
But its very nature operating on trust and not requiring traditional banking records makes it highly vulnerable to abuse.
Exactly. While it is legitimate, Hawala leaves a minimal paper trail that is almost impossible for Western banking regulators to follow effectively. And this opacity makes it ideal for money laundering by criminal enterprises and, critically, for terror financing, as investigators noted in that briefing.
And the core allegation is that as the stolen funds from Minnesota moved through these opaque networks and into Somalia, Al-Shabaab took a non-negotiable cut.
That is the central explosive conclusion of the federal analysts. They determined that stolen U.S. taxpayer dollars routed through these Minnesota-based criminal networks inevitably enriched Al-Shabaab.
This raises the critical analytical point you mentioned earlier. The sources emphasize this did not require direct intentional collaboration between the fraudsters in Minnesota and the terrorist group. Can you explain the mechanism of this unintentional enrichment?
This is where the structural reality of the terror group's control comes into play. You see, Al-Shabaab is not just a militant organization. They function as a kind of shadow government in central and southern Somalia. They control major economic corridors, road systems, checkpoints, and vast swaths of territory.
So if you want to move goods or if you want to move money through their domain, you pay them.
Precisely. Al-Shabaab effectively levies mandatory taxes and fees, they often term it zakat or customs duties, on virtually all commerce and remittances passing through or into the territory they control. So whether the money is humanitarian aid, legitimate remittances, or in this case stolen welfare funds, the terrorist group simply extracts revenue from anything moving through its domain.
So the Minnesota fraudsters didn't have to be ideological supporters of Al-Shabaab at all. They just had to rely on the Hawala system to move illicit bulk cash into a territory where the terror group acts as the inescapable taxing authority.
That's the critical insight. The act of transferring large volumes of money via these informal networks into that specific region under the known control dynamics of Al-Shabaab guarantees terrorist enrichment. Even if the transfer was unintentional in its final destination, the security consequence was unavoidable. This reality intensified the perceived urgency and provided the necessary national security grounds for the immediate, sweeping TPS termination.
The revelation that U.S. welfare dollars could be involuntarily supporting an al-Qaeda-linked group, and we should remind everyone, Shabaab is linked to al-Qaeda. That must have just ignited national outrage.
It absolutely did. The public reaction was seismic, particularly across conservative media and political circles. There was disbelief and just white-hot anger that the welfare programs designed to help American children could be so easily exploited, and that stolen American money might actually be financing a foreign terror group responsible for atrocities.
And how is this immediately leveraged politically?
Conservatives immediately viewed this crisis as definitive proof that lax policies had created massive, tangible national security vulnerabilities. The political framing was crystal clear. The fraud and the terror connection were direct consequences of weak immigration oversight and lax welfare controls.
The narrative shifted immediately to demanding accountability not just for the criminals, but for the systems that failed them.
Yes. And President Trump's subsequent action, framing the targeted TPS termination as a non-negotiable national security measure, perfectly leveraged this outrage. It signaled a new, aggressive enforcement shift, emphasizing that national security concerns now supersede typical bureaucratic or diplomatic considerations in immigration policy.
It's devastating chain. Fraud, ignored warnings, and a terror connection. But all of this points back to a massive systemic failure inside the state government. Let's look at that. Systemic failure and the political shield. The question remains, how did Minnesota's government miss over $1 billion in fraud?
Well, the answer seems to lie in a combination of profound operational failures and deep political hesitation. Operationally, state agencies were completely overwhelmed. The sources describe them as dramatically understaffed, particularly in fraud investigative units, and just completely unprepared for the sudden, massive influx of applications tied to emergency pandemic relief.
The system simply couldn't handle the speed or the volume while maintaining adequate scrutiny.
Exactly. We talked about the example of the 35-seat restaurant claiming 18,000 meals daily.
Right.
Inspectors later admitted they ignored these obvious red flags, not out of malice, but because the systems weren't designed to flag anomalies that defied common sense. The automation of payment meant that if the initial paperwork appeared minimally acceptable, the payments were processed without cross-referencing logistical capacity or provider history.
So the system was built for expediency and volume, not for fraud prevention.
The design was fundamentally flawed. The fraud was allowed to metastasize unchecked because the oversight mechanism was broken and lacked the necessary manpower and technological checks to correlate these astronomical numbers with physical reality. This systemic failure created the perfect environment for a linked criminal ecosystem to flourish.
But the sources suggest the failure was not purely operational. There are strong allegations that political considerations played a substantial role in softening scrutiny.
This is a highly sensitive but critical component of the source's analysis. Insiders claim there was political pressure leading to softened scrutiny and delayed investigations specifically within this demographic.
Why would officials fear scrutinizing a fraud investigation? What was the fear?
The allegation centers on the political cost. The Somali American community holds substantial electoral influence in key areas, notably Minneapolis and the surrounding suburbs, which includes the District of Representative Ilhan Omar. Officials allegedly feared that aggressive investigation and prosecution would jeopardize support for a key demographic group and lead to accusations of ethnic or religious bias, severely impacting their electoral prospects.
So the fear of political backlash effectively created a shield that allowed criminals within that community to operate with relative impunity.
Intentional or not, that was the effect. The need to maintain political support and avoid controversy surrounding discrimination effectively paralyzed the investigative process at the state level. And this provided the ideal incubation period for the multi-program fraud network to grow exponentially in size and complexity before it reached a point where federal agents could no longer ignore it.
And once the indictment started stacking up, the public reaction focused heavily on the conspicuous silence of key state leadership, particularly Governor Tim Walz and Representative Ilhan Omar.
Yes. Both figures had previously been champions of Minnesota's social safety net and robust community engagement programs. Yet once the scale of the financial crime became undeniable, and especially after the al-Shabaab link surfaced, their response was notably muted. Neither offered immediate, comprehensive explanations for the collapse of state oversight or the years of ignored warnings.
How did critics and investigators interpret this silence?
Critics quickly interpreted their refusal to offer immediate transparency or take decisive action regarding agency heads as political self-preservation. This suspicion was amplified by revelations in the source material suggesting that some of the organizations involved in the fraud rings had previously engaged with and even received praise from local officials.
In a crisis of this magnitude, the absence of aggressive accountability from the top just fuels suspicion.
It does. Their silence, in the face of billion-dollar losses and national security concerns, amplified the perception that the political leadership had prioritized minimizing public relations damage over immediately addressing the core issues of fraud and systemic negligence. This really set the stage for the federal government to step in with the most aggressive possible response.
Which brings us to the final ongoing confrontation: the legal quagmire and the future of enforcement. The TPS termination is a national policy, but here it was applied based on state residency. That is a truly novel legal challenge.
It creates a tremendous legal tension. Legal scholars are debating the validity of using state residency as a trigger for terminating a nationwide policy like TPS. Those challenging the order argue vehemently that TPS must be applied uniformly based on nationality and conditions in the home country, not based on association with a particular U.S. state, regardless of criminal activity.
They see it as a form of collective punishment.
Exactly. They see this as a violation of procedural fairness and potentially a form of collective punishment.
However, the counter-argument is entirely rooted in the National Security Clause, isn't it?
It is. Those supporting the administration's action argue that national security exceptions grant the president wide and decisive authority, overriding normal procedural constraints. When the financial pipeline supporting a designated terrorist organization is localized to one specific area, the targeted policy intervention is, in their view, legally justified as a necessary defensive measure.
So this clash of legal interpretations, uniformity versus security necessity, has plunged lawyers, advocacy groups, and the affected population into intense uncertainty.
The immediate impact is panic and a frantic effort to file legal challenges and seek injunctions. But in the meantime, the government is moving forward. Following the termination, President Trump issued a directive calling for a rapid, expansive enforcement operation.
And what were the specifics of that enforcement directive?
DHS and ICE were instructed to launch aggressive operations across Minnesota, immediately prioritizing individuals tied to the existing criminal indictments, individuals who worked for the fraudulent organizations, or those flagged for suspicious financial transfers. All TPS cases associated with the region were flagged for accelerated review and potential deportation proceedings.
This action signals the most aggressive immigration enforcement shift since the current administration took power, framed by federal officials as a necessary action to dismantle networks exploiting immigration protections for criminal gain.
And the forecast is grim for those involved. The source material warns this is only the beginning. The president promised the most expansive anti-fraud crackdown in U.S. history, moving far beyond Minnesota. But this state has been cast as the opening battlefield, transforming a quiet Midwestern hub into the epicenter of a fierce national debate covering fraud, federalism, immigration, and the limits of executive power.
It is a profound demonstration of how deeply interwoven welfare fraud, political negligence, and international security concerns can become.
Thank you. And thank you to our listeners. The complexity here lies not just in the sheer audacity of the crime, the staggering financial figures from the fake meal sites, the phantom autism therapy, the explosive housing fraud, but in the systems of accountability that allowed the exploitation to thrive for so long, demanding a deeper, nationwide look at governance and accountability in the face of political expediency.
That's all for this deep dive. But it leaves us with one haunting question. If the guardians of the rules are the first to break them, who is left to protect the game?